Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 11 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is An Amateur's Toolbox, the HarperCollins Study Bible. I bill myself as the Amateur Exegete. I chose this moniker in part because I wanted to stress the fact that I'm not a scholar, not by any stretch of the imagination. Yes, I've had training in Greek and Hebrew. Yes, I've done a lot of reading and writing on topics related to biblical studies. Nevertheless, I lack any advanced credentials, such as a graduate or doctoral degree, with which I can make any scholarly pronouncements. Instead, my aim is to point the way to sound resources that fellow amateurs can put on their shelves as they approach the biblical texts. And, for the next few episodes of Bible Study for Amateurs, I'll be giving listeners a glimpse into this amateur's Bible Study Toolbox. As I get started, let me note that I won't be talking about any Greek or Hebrew resources. Few of my fellow amateurs have had training in biblical languages, so I'm hesitant to give them tools that they wouldn't know how to use properly. I'll be focusing on English language resources that are accessible to just about everyone, beginning with the HarperCollins Study Bible. Most of you listening are probably familiar with study Bibles, whether it's the MacArthur Study Bible from the infamous John MacArthur, the NIV Life Application Study Bible that aims to take the words of the ancient text to apply them to modern life, or the ESV Study Bible that was my personal favorite during my late 20s. It still sits on my shelf today. Study Bibles are designed to feed your curiosity, but not all study Bibles are equal. My absolute favorite is the revised and updated HarperCollins Study Bible. Based upon the text of the New Revised Standard Version, the HarperCollins Study Bible offers its readers an ecumenical biblical text coupled with notes from a diverse cast of characters, including Jacob Milgram, Beverly Robert Scaventa, Michael Fox, no, not that Michael Fox, C. Clifton Black, Joanne Hackett, Richard Nelson, Adela Yarbrough Collins, and many more. Though the names represent various faith views, the introduction to the Study Bible observes that what unites them is the tradition of historical, critical, and open scholarship that has been fostered for more than a century by the Society of Biblical Literature, the sponsor of the present project. In other words, the world's premier organization for the study of the Bible stands behind the notes in the HarperCollins Study Bible. That's a big deal. Each book of the Bible, including well over a dozen so-called apocryphal works like Tobit, Wisdom of Solomon, 1st Esdras, and more, begins with a brief introduction to the work that includes background information like the piece's historical origins, its structure, and more. For example, in the introduction to the Book of Judges, written by Robert Boiling and revised by Richard Nelson, there is a section on historical context, one on the narrative's various protagonists, and finally, a reconstruction of the four-stage development of the book. The introduction to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written by Victor Paul Furnish, offers readers a glimpse into the church at Corinth, the reasons Paul wrote the epistle, the style the apostle uses throughout it, and more. Having this sort of background information is vital for properly understanding the texts that follow. But introductions are not all that this study Bible brings to the toolbox. Beneath the biblical text are notes, often verse by verse, that help explain the text for modern readers. For example, In his notes on Isaiah chapter 52 verse 13 to chapter 53 verse 12, the so-called fourth servant song, J.M. Roberts explains, first, how the song was appropriated by later Christian exegetes, before then explaining what the song likely meant in its original context. That is, the servant was Israel in exile. So, when Isaiah chapter 52 verse 14 describes the astonishment at the servant despite his marred appearance and a form beyond that of mortals, Roberts writes, God's deliverance and exaltation of Israel will astound the nations, who formerly despised the disfigured slave, adding in a cross-reference to Isaiah chapter 49 verse 7. There are a few downsides to this volume, however. For example, while there are maps sprinkled here and there throughout, they aren't of great quality, but they get the job done, providing geographic context for the biblical text. Another downside is the number of explanatory articles. Before the book of Genesis, you'll find an article by John Barton on Bible reading strategies, a piece by Ronald Hendel on Israelite religion, a missive by David on Greco-Roman context for the New Testament, and 2 articles on archaeology by Eric Myers and Jürgen Zuckenberg. But compared to the volume we'll look at next week, the New Oxford Annotated Bible, this seems puny. Despite these downsides, the HarperCollins Study Bible is typically the first tool from my amateur toolbox that I grab when I'm working on a passage. And my volume is getting worn out to the point where in the next few years it will be time to purchase a new one. Perhaps by then, there'll be a new edition. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time. And remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.